Hi APE students, welcome to Environmental Science. Video 4 is on environmental economics. So some of the resources that we can use to make our products, we have natural resources. This would be something like coal, oil, rocks, minerals. We have manufactured resources. These are things that people have created. Think about parts of a car, for example. We have human resources. This is the actual human capital, using people as labor, things like that. And when you put all these things together, you get our goods and services that we can actually produce and sell. So some basic ideas about economics. We need to understand basic principles of supply and demand before we can talk about environmental economics. So imagine that I wanted to sell this AP Environmental Science Barron's practice book. It has a lot of practice test examples. By the way, if you haven't bought this book, really good book that you should buy to give yourself some practice before the AP exam. So over here on this graph, I've got price on the y-axis, and I've got quantity on the x. And what we're going to look at, we're going to see how different prices and supplies affects the demand. So here's our supply curve. What you'll see is if I charge $2, then I can make 10. If I charge 4, I'd make 20, and you can kind of go and see how the supply curve is affected. And when I add the demand curve up here, this is what do the consumers actually demand at certain prices. So we'll look first at, say I sold this book for $4. So if I sold it for $4, I made 20 of them. However, my demand for them was 40. So if my demand was 40 and my supply was only 20, then that means that we have what we call a shortage. So that would be something where, I didn't make as many as people actually wanted to buy at $4. So I can also do the same thing. I can say that, okay, I'm going to charge $8 instead of $4. And this time I made 40 of them because before my demand was 40. However, at $8, my demand is not 40, my demand is only 20 if I go down here and look at this. So that means that I'm going to have a surplus. I made too many of those books for the price that I'm selling them at. So in economics, what you want is you want to hit this equilibrium point right here. You want to make as many as your customers are going to demand, and you want to have a price that is set so that the customers will actually buy it at that price. So our equilibrium point is about $6 selling at 30 books. Now, when you start to look at externalities are the external costs, environmental costs, in other words. So please be aware of that when we were talking about the difference in prices of tuna from Walmart to Whole Foods, for example. This is your price for that. That's where that price difference comes from. So this is the environmental economic side of things. So if I include those external costs, the cost of the environment, what's going to happen to my supply and demand curve? My supply curve is going to shift up, which means that my equilibrium point up here is now, instead of being $6, because I'm including the environmental costs, it's going to be closer to $7.50. So that is how we're looking at what the environmental costs are. How do we include environmental costs into the economics of things? So this is a diagram showing kind of how the economic process works. So all your natural capital initially comes from the sun. You have your raw materials, your coal, your oil, your natural gas, your air, your water. And what we're doing is we're putting these things into our economic system, our production and consumption cycle. So things are produced, you buy them and consume them. The part that is dealing with environment is this right side over here. So we're depleting non-renewable resources. We're also throwing waste out into the environment. And as you can imagine, the faster this production and consumption cycle goes, the more waste we end up with. So we want to be able to recycle. However, we know that recycling itself is not going to fix the entire problem. So looking at some economic development, you want to be able to give me some examples of unsustainable versus sustainable development. So when we're doing unsustainable, we're focused more on quantity rather than quality of the products. When we're looking at our natural resources, we don't consider them to be very important if we're doing unsustainable development, whereas they are important and sustainable. In terms of resource fate, matter is just simply discarded. Whereas with sustainable, it's recycled or reused if possible. And in terms of pollution, we're focused on cleanup and on sustainable economic growth, whereas we're focused on prevention and sustainable growth. So trying to not have all the waste to begin with. So looking at our GDP versus GPI, GDP you're probably familiar with is gross domestic product. That's how we in the United States usually measure growth. Most countries measure growth. That's all the goods and services produced in your country. However, it does not take into effect externalities, the external environmental costs of things. So we want to use this genuine progress indicator down here. This is going to be very important to us. I'm going to underline it because this is what we want to actually use when we are doing and talking about environmental science and economics. So this is your GDP minus the environmental costs. So this does include pollution, waste, all those nasty things that people have to deal with. And that's going to give you a much better indicator of what is the actual quality of life in an area. So here's our GDP versus GPI. GDP, as you'll see, has increased linearly going all the way up. This is 1996, but it still is projected same for today. But if you look at the GPI, which does include the pollution, the waste, all that stuff, you'll see that it kind of has leveled off. And same thing for 2015, 17, presumably going into 2020 to 50. You'll see that it hasn't been going up. So even though our GDP, how much money we are making, has been going up, the amount of quality of life, pollution, those kinds of things have stayed level. So a question we're going to be talking about is, should we include the full market pricing when we're selling prices for goods and services? So should we be including these externalities, the environmental costs of things? Is it good to be able to buy something at Walmart for 99 cents when it's $4.99 somewhere else? So looking at environmental taxes and fees, what can the government do to try to regulate? If you tax companies and try to include environmental costs in things, it will bring about the full cost pricing, the externalities. It'll provide incentives for businesses to do better for the environment, to recycle, to reduce waste, all that stuff. And it's fairly easy to detect whether or not someone is doing that. So disadvantages, unfortunately, it usually it penalizes low-income groups a little bit more than it would higher-income people. It's also really hard to determine the level of the taxes and fees. At what point should we be taxing people? And you have to readjust those labels, which can potentially be politically difficult. It's hard to raise taxes, for example. A lot of times that's very politically a negative concept. So how can we improve? Again, the government can set limits on pollution. We can give permits to users. We could even allow people to trade permits. That's called cap and trade. Maybe I'm not polluting a lot, but this other company is, so they can pay me so that they can pollute more. Environmental regulations tend to be something that is politically not ideal. People tend to be a little bit against it because they think that it hurts businesses, when in reality, it's going to help everybody because everyone is going to be breathing that air and drinking that water. And then finally, we have some sustainable businesses and careers. So these are some careers that you can be involved in that are going to be sustainable. Some of them are not even necessarily that big right now, but they will be in the future. So we have things like aquaculture, biofuels, climate change research, environmental design. So we get some engineering concepts in there, environmental health, fuel cell technology, hydrogen energy, marine science. All of these different things are going to be sustainable careers that you could go into if you are interested in these kinds of topics. All right, bring your questions with you tomorrow to class, and we will talk more about this.